Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to analyze Bayer Leverkusen star Kai Havertz and break down how he's developed into one of the best players in the Bundesliga. When we break it all down, what I should state first is that we're going to look at the last 4 games following the restart to kind of get an idea as to how Kai Havertz goes about his business. When you look at Bayer Leverkusen, they do play in a 4-2-3-1, but they have shifted into a 3-4-3 as well. When you look at how Havertz goes about his business, it's very simple. He plays up front, but what you can see here is that he often operates in more of a dual role. When he's up front, he has the aerial ability to get onto crosses, so you do see him break into goal-scoring positions in between the center back and the fullback and in between the center backs when balls are played out wide to either Weiser or Singraven. However, there are times, specifically more in that 3-4-3, where we end up seeing how he does look to operate as more of a false 9. What we've seen from Havertz is he likes to drift into the spaces in beyond the wider players when they're pushed out to the fullbacks, and he'll try to receive the ball ahead of the opposing side's fullback or try to drag out the center back to receive the ball in that pocket of space. If they're playing a 3-4-3, the reason why Havertz is so devastating is based off the fact that he can operate in that dual role. He can make those runs in behind the defense or show for the ball, but the other issue here is the fact that he could drop off deeper into those pockets of space to receive the ball. If you have Havertz dropping off deeper and there are no players sticking towards him, what it does look like Leverkusen wants is that they have speedy players out in those wider areas, and it does make sense for them to make runs in behind. The Diabys, the Bellarabis, the Vertzes, and also Leon Bailey, who can break into those spaces, and sometimes we do see a Miri out there as well. When you assess his weaknesses, what you end up seeing is that if Havertz does drop off deeper, what we've seen in the games where he hasn't been that effective is that defenders mark tight on him. He's not the greatest with his back to goal, but if he's able to get half a yard on you, that's all he needs to link play with his teammates. When defenders or midfielders have shifted towards him and marked him tightly, Havertz has struggled to control the ball, and he often does lose it. The manner in which Havertz has been able to dictate games has when he's been able to drop off into that space freely or with time to control the ball and get his teammates into play or break forward. We'll break down the positives and the negatives of Havertz's performances. We'll start in chronological order and we'll look to Leverkusen's initial win against Werder Bremen. What we end up seeing here is that we had Havertz ahead of Amiri in a 4-2-3-1, and this is where you end up seeing Havertz having to shift his positioning based off the fact that Amiri was looking to receive that ball in between the lines with Kevin Vogt looking to track him. When we look to one example, we have Aranguiz dropping off ahead of Selke, and he ends up locating Havertz dropping ahead of Friedel, and he ends up splitting Rashica and Eggestein to find Havertz ahead of the Werder Bremen left back. When Havertz receives that ball, you end up seeing Vertze drift laterally ahead of Moisander, and that's where you end up seeing Havertz link play with Vertze based off the fact that Friedel didn't get tight to Havertz. Ultimately, the 2 goals that Havertz scored in that game epitomize his aerial threat and his center forward movement in towards that box. What you end up seeing for the first goal is a Demmer by diagonal out to Diaby. He's able to beat Friedel 1v1 moving towards the byline, and he ends up clipping the ball over Velkovic to find Havertz darting in between Selassie and Velkovic to not a free header into the net. And if we want to look to an example of Havertz's great creative play, what we end up seeing in that second half is that you have Weiser being closed down by Bittencourt, and he ends up sliding the ball out to the touchline for substitute Bellarabi pulling out Friedel. And what you end up seeing there is that even before Bellarabi received that ball, you had Havertz dropping into his own half to look for possession. Moisander doesn't step tightly to him immediately, but by the time Havertz gets the ball, you end up seeing Moisander's looking to step into that path. He waited too long, and by the time Havertz receives that ball, he ends up playing it around Moisander looking to make a tackle, and he ends up setting Bellarabi free into that right channel. Ultimately, that's the ideal move for Leverkusen when you have Havertz in that position, is that you want him to drop deeper, bring defenders in towards him, and then use his ability to play those incisive passes to set players free in behind. When we shift to Leverkusen against Gladbach, what we ended up seeing was that Leverkusen were in more of a 3-4-3, and Havertz's movement involved him shifting laterally across that midfield zone, looking to receive the ball in between the lines and in pockets of space. But we also saw him shifting out into that left channel in space behind Liner, who was pushing forward, to receive the ball to combine with Diaby. But ultimately, Havertz's initial impact in that game was based off his center forward movement. We ended up seeing Demirbay receive the ball from a Strobel loose pass in midfield, and he ended up locating Bellarabi in space in between Ben Sabani and Elvedi. He ended up sliding the ball out to Bellarabi in that zone, and when Elvedi was forced to step out into that position, it created a gap in between Elvedi and Ginter for Havertz to dart into. It was Havertz who was the decisive figure in the overall outcome of that game. Havertz received the ball ahead of Strobel in that second half, and he located the run of Bellarabi off Ben Sabani. What Havertz did there was he was able to split Elvedi and Ben Sabani to find Bellarabi breaking into right half space, and that was how Leverkusen won the penalty that Havertz ultimately converted. However, it was the game against Wolfsburg that highlighted the limitations in Havertz's overall game at this moment. What we ended up seeing from Wolfsburg is that they dropped off into two narrow banks of four, and Havertz did look to drop into space in between Arnold and Schlager, but his predominant moves were often in those gaps between Schlager and Victor, or in behind Victor when he was pulled out by Weiser receiving the ball. However, Wolfsburg were able to collectively limit his overall threat by having players stick tight to Havertz when he received the ball. So if Havertz looked to drop into space between Schlager and Victor, Schlager was often shifting across to win the ball off him or force him wide out to Bellarabi. There were times where he did drift into that space behind Victor to receive the ball ahead of Roussillon, but Roussillon was tight on him, and if there was ever a time where it looked like Havertz would beat him 1v1, Victor or Stefan, depending who was on that flank, would drop off deeper to limit that threat and make it a 1v2 situation. Even when we saw Havertz try to receive the ball between Schlager and Arnold, there was a time where Bender found him between the lines, but Brooks stepped in, and we ended up seeing Arnold clip that loose ball over Aranguiz and Bender for Victor running across the Leverkusen center back. But as you can see against Wolfsburg, they had a clear plan to deal with Havertz. It was stick tight on him, ensure that he can't turn, have Schlager step into him, and on the rare occasion when he tried to dart into space beyond Roussillon, Brooks did a very good job, and when he looked to get into 1v1 situations with Roussillon, when Roussillon was tight, he won the ball, and then Roussillon had protection if need be. And when we look to Havertz's last game for Leverkusen against Freiburg, they followed the same principle that Wolfsburg employed on Havertz. When he looked to drop off into space between the midfield or in those gaps between Koch and Salai or Grifo and Hoffler, they would have the center back step towards him. What you notice is that if you have the center back stepping in towards him, he was often dropping off the ball into the path of Sint-Graven or Bailey. If you give Havertz half a yard, he's able to link play, and then he'll look to break into space between the center backs or the center backs and the full backs. But if you stick tight to him, you have a good chance of winning the ball, because at this age, he's not the greatest with his back to goal when there is tight pressure on him. You saw Dragovic finding him in those pockets of space in midfield, but on several occasions when Leonhardt or Heinz were stepping towards him, he was unable to turn and play positive passes. But when they didn't, that's when Leverkusen created their best chances. And even when you witness Havertz's winning goal, it starts with Aranguiz ahead of Hoffler and Koch, and he ends up splitting them to find Havertz ahead of Leonhardt. Havertz instantly flicks the ball into the path of Bailey running across Kubler. What we end up seeing from Havertz is he continues his run goal side of Salai, high on the overlap, and that's when we end up seeing Bailey play an intricate reverse ball in between his two markers to find Havertz breaking towards goal, and he's able to finish from a tight angle. So when you break down Kai Havertz's overall game, what you could see is that he's perfected this hybrid role for Leverkusen and plays a key role in them creating and scoring goals. What you end up seeing is that yes, he can operate as a legitimate threat in and around the box when he breaks in behind, and because of his aerial threat, that gives another dimension to his game. When we end up looking at how he affects the game from a creative aspect, he drops deeper into those pockets of spaces and he looks for his teammates that are a bit quicker to break in behind. That's how Kai Havertz has developed into one of the Bundesliga's rising stars. And yes, he is versatile and can play in multiple roles, but this looks like his best position if you want to get the best out of him. Hi everybody, thanks for watching, and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.